Namaskar and welcome to this exciting new episode of Sattology, Debunking Mythology. Today we have a very special guest with us. The word secularism has been invented like the separation of state and the religion. And it was purposely done to ensure justice because it was very difficult to follow common law where some people follow some faith and some people do not follow that faith. So the secularism word was invented again. The origins are again I connected to France, but still we'll see uh, how our guest speaks about it. We have a very wonderful guest, a great researcher, great thinker, and lives in Delhi. And so we would like to welcome Mr. Come Carpentier.
Namaskar. Greetings again to you and to the audience.
So, so what is the origin of the word secularism, and what was it meant to be?
Thank you for inviting me. First, I would like to clarify that I and I'm sure you have nothing against secularism. It is a
Correct.
very interesting, noble, and I would say necessary notion, provided we understand what it means. And there are many different understandings of secularism. Now, I think we had this. We talked about that in a previous, program of yours,
Mhm.
but not quite in the sense that I would like to discuss today. Secularism was essentially a Latin word, which is related to seculum, which means century in Latin, 100 years. So secularism meant that you lived in the century. In other words, you did not live in the time of the prophets or Jesus Christ, of the Bible. You lived in the present, and therefore you adapted to the age, which in that case, at the time when secularism was first used, was the Middle Age in Europe. So what the Catholic Church defined through secularism was the church that lived in the world, as opposed to the regular church which lived in convents and monasteries. So convents and monasteries had their own rule, and they were supposed to live outside the world. That's why they were called regular. The secular church had to adjust to day-to-day circumstances because they lived in the midst of civilian or non-religious people. Therefore, the priests and people who practice religion were not strained to the rules, to the constraints that governed religious institutions. So that's the root of secularism. And as you see, it doesn't really make any allowance for what we consider today to be materialism or non-religious ideas. It's very much religious, it's part of religion, but it's just the application of religion to day-to-day life. Now, this, of course, implied that in Europe at the time, there was only one religion, which was the Catholic religion, which they later split up into various sects, Protestant sects. And therefore, it kept that significance, which was in fact deeply religious and Catholic, probably until about the 19th century, or let's say the late 18th century, when there was a definite break between the state and religion. The first to do so was the French revolutionary state in 1789, when it decided that religion should not rule society. Religion could be allowed, although there was some serious discussion and disagreement about how much religion you actually could allow. Some people in the French Revolution's dispensation were very anti-religious, particularly anti-Catholic. But others felt that religion had its place, provided it was submitted to the laws of the state, and provided it didn't regulate common law. Now, this is what secularism, therefore, in its modern sense, became. It became the definition of a state where everybody can practice his or her own religion, but is not supposed to display it in public, or even if they display it, they are not supposed to claim that religion gives them a special right or privilege, or that they cannot do certain things because their religion forbids it. For example, in a let's say in a Western society which is based on Judeo-Christian principles, that's very important because we understand that secularism doesn't mean that there is no religious background. It can very well be a religious background, and in the case of the West, it's mostly Christianity. In that particular set of society, if, for example, you want to be polygamist, then you are not supposed to be legally because that society recognizes only monogamy, legally speaking. So in that sense, you can say, yeah, but my religion authorizes me to have more than one wife, therefore I will have several wives. Technically, you cannot do that. I mean, you can do that privately if you women want to live with you, but you cannot claim they are all your wives. So that's, we can see how much the concept of secularism has evolved. In fact, in France, it never had this sense because secularism in French, secularism, doesn't mean the same thing at all. Secularism has a completely different meaning, which we won't get into. In France, we call it laïcité, which means the state of the lay people, the people who have not taken religious orders. So you see, when we look at the modern world, which is where religions are mingling and often clashing, or at least coexisting, uneasily or not, secularism has become a bone of contention because it has many different meanings. In many cases, including Western societies, but perhaps India, there is a tendency, especially among the left-wing thinkers, to believe that majority religion should be practically made invisible, or it should be kept very private. For example, you can't have religious symbols in public places, whether churches or malls or any kind of official building. You have to keep it within your home. And once you are outside, you're not supposed to display a Christian faith. In fact, in many cases, they don't even want you to wear a cross. This is the case in Britain if you have any kind of government-related position, or if you work, for example, in the airlines. But on the other hand, if you belong to a minority religion, you seem to have certain privileges in the sense that then they tolerate or even encourage you to display your religious identity because it's considered to be a form of toleration and recognition of diversity. That in itself poses a problem because if you recognize diversity but you suppress the majority religion, then you are essentially making the people who are you might say, the backbone of the country, that they cannot really manifest any kind of religious conviction, whereas the people who belong to minorities that often came later are supposed to be allowed to do that. And this is very much the case in countries like Britain, for example. Germany has a different status because in Germany, the state is officially Christian. It sponsors religious Christian denominations with tax money, although as a German citizen, you can refuse to have your 10% taken from your taxes to be given to religion. You can say, I do not want that, I will pay 10% less tax because I don't want any money to go to religion. But if you don't say that, technically, at least I'm not aware if there is a change, but a few years ago, you could actually, you normally, in fact, contributed to the maintenance of Christian churches. In other words, it was all done proportionately according to the number of faithful between the various Catholic and Protestant denominations. In France, it's very different because even though the state finances the Catholic Church, it actually provides some money for the maintenance of priests. It also says that the state and the church should be completely separate, and there shouldn't be any, let's say, participation by the church in state functions or processes, which in itself is a bit problematic because when the Pope comes to France, he is given a formal head of state welcome by the President of France. And very often a mass takes place at the National Cathedral or at some public place, and very often the President or some of the ministers go to attend that mass. That is justified on the grounds that it is their personal faith and also that the Pope is a head of state. Therefore, he should be given proper protocol as a visiting head of state. But as you can see, this is slightly hypocritical because you don't give the same recognition, say, to the Dalai Lama or to a great religious leader from India or from any other place. And of course, minorities have often objected to the fact that despite the secular, the laic constitution of the French state, there seems to be some sort of privilege given to Christianity and particularly to Catholicism. So that has led to some attempts to change that, but of course the right normally doesn't want to change it. The left would like to change it to the point where it is often seen as being anti-religious altogether, but strangely enough, only anti-Christian, not necessarily anti-Jewish or anti-Muslim or anti-Hindu. However, and I could go on like that, but I will probably let you come back before I say any more. I should also point out that one of the problems that is being found now is that a lot of people in the majority community are fed up with what they consider to be discrimination against them, and they are calling for a stronger and more visible role of the Christian faith. Just as in other countries, other people want their religion, whether it is Islam, Shia Islam, Sunni Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, to be fully and duly recognized, which in many countries it is. Most Buddhist countries have got a Buddhist state church, if you want to call it a church, although I think that's slightly misleading. And in India, which is a very unique case, you have Hinduism, which is not a church, and that should not be confused with a church in the Christian sense, but which is a sort of a federation or confederation of many different belief systems and practices and philosophies that are generally united around a common recognition of a transcendent truth, which was first spelled out in some great scriptures.
Great opening statement you gave, and now it brings to my natural second question is, when did this minority and majority politics start in the world, if you have any idea on that? Because this minority and majority doesn't mean anything for the common man. With a person on the street is just interested in basic services, good governance, and good access to law, which can give him justice. So this minority and majority concept, when did it start according to you?
Well, it has deep roots because obviously there are always minorities. It's the nature of human societies. They always generate minorities. And one of the first visible minorities in the European societies was the Jewish minority, which in fact in most European states was a state within the state, in the sense that they had their own tax system, they had their own funeral and burial grounds, and they basically kept to themselves, which created a lot of problems because they were seen as having more wealth than the common citizen. And very often they were expelled from successive European countries because they were regarded as not being part of the body politic, as being, as I said, a state within a state. So you can see that the minority concept existed very much in antiquity and in the Middle Age. Then when the Protestants came into existence, in many countries they were a minority. In other places they became a majority. And where they became a majority, then they claimed the state and said there is no room for Catholics. This was the case of several countries in Northern Europe, where essentially, there was that famous saying in the 17th century when peace was willy-nilly made in Europe after a very bloody 30 years war, when the principle that was enunciated in Latin was cuius regio, eius religio, which meant the religion of the kingdom should be the religion of should be the king's faith. In the sense, if you have a Protestant king, then the kingdom should be Protestant and all Catholics should go, unless they can find some modus vivendi as a minority. In Muslim states, we know that there was the zimmi or dhimmi status, which means if you are a minority, Christian or Jewish, you are a client, a guest, but you should know your position, you should know your place. You are not part of the ummah, of the majority. So the same happened in Catholic countries, which very often grudgingly gave a place to Jews and Protestants, but regarded them as people who had certain obligations and didn't necessarily have all the rights of the majority. So that's how the minority majority concept evolved. And I'm not sure I agree with you when you say that most people don't care about it, because I find minorities are generally very conscious of their status and their identity, and they don't like being assimilated or integrated fully. They like to keep their own system. And you see that even in small countries like Bhutan. I was just reading an article we are publishing about how Bhutan has tried to bring the minorities into its fold, Drukpa majority Buddhist ethnic groups, and has had a lot of problems because most of those minorities don't like to be assimilated. So Bhutan has sometimes taken drastic decisions of expelling them, of saying you can't be a Bhutanese if you don't speak the language, behave like us, believe like us, etc., etc. So you see, minority majority issues are always there, and I think they always will be there. You have a choice of either trying to expel all the minorities or dealing with them and giving them a fair status, which doesn't mean that minorities should claim that they have a right to regulate the lifestyle of the majority. That's where you get in abuse. When minorities say, I don't like this, therefore you shouldn't do it. And of course, you have to say, excuse me, you are a minority. If you like to have it your way, you can. But then if you want us to follow your way, that's not acceptable. So that is where there has to be coexistence, understanding, and obviously tolerance. Because if you believe that only your faith and your belief is right and that everybody else is wrong, that in itself will create a problem. And that's where we have to somehow educate people into I would say, a relativistic acceptance of the diversity of cultures.
See, in a little bit contest you there, and I know you can answer it very well. So, the in the history of India, if you say Cholas were the very huge kingdom. In the landmass was way bigger than even today's India in terms of their expanse towards Southeast Asia and other places. Now, in that history, it is very well documented because the culture of Hindu culture is not primarily, even though it's a multiple belief system, it's one culture, Sanatan Dharma, whatever you call it, it's one culture based on one text, Vedic texts, and within the Hindu society, there are multiple belief system also. Somebody is following teachings of Shiva, somebody is following teachings of Ganesh, and many other different are there. But ultimately, it all connects together at the end. But there was never a scenario where somebody was discriminated on the basis of their belief. At least in documented history, is not there. So when temple is there, a temple, any belief system can go to a temple, whether it is Shiva Bhakta or you are a Ganesh, any of the devatas or Hari, which is Vishnu, which is considered the top most. You can go to any of these temples, and anybody can express their faith or practice their faith. Even today, multiple belief systems go to any temple they want. So this minority and majority concept was not there, even though there were no Christians at that time, there were no Muslims at that time. It was not there. But if you see the Europe's culture, particularly after the founding of Christianity, before that, the recorded history has been rejected or deleted from many of the records of the Europe. But if you see that after that, the faith becomes a prominent denominator of rights. If you belong to that faith, then you have the rights. And I think that's where the culture of minority majority came. And you said it correctly, that the king wanted to, if he was a Protestant, then everyone should be Protestant. And that's where the culture came in. Same is with Judaism also. In Judaism also, exclusivity of their faith is important. Not in the modern Israel. Modern Israel is pretty much non is a secular country, you can say, or non-faith denomination country, where the majority are following the Jewish culture and the minority can be Arab Muslims or Christians, Coptic Christians or other Christians who are living over there. But in if you look at the Indian society, then this distinction was not there on the basis of belief. The concept of Loktantra was there. Loktantra means the state will work towards the benefit of all without any belief system. So this contrast of minority majority is not prevalent inherently in the Indian culture, but with the modern Indian democracy, The because secular concepts, the minority majority has become a big contention in India. But the basic needs of the people are different. Basic needs are, they need to get good roads, they need to get security, they need to get employment, they need to get access to law which is equal to all. That has not changed. So how does this minority majority contest, how far it can go, because it's not practical.
Well, it can. We know very well it can lead to separatism and to breakup
Correct.
of countries. I mean, it's happening even in countries that are not very religious anymore, like Spain,
Yeah.
where the Catalans claim a separate identity, and the Basques and feel that they should have their own state, and that basically nobody should be allowed to speak Spanish or write in Spanish in Catalonia because they want everybody to speak Catalan. So it can show you that minorities can be extreme, just like majorities can be extreme. Now, the case of India is very interesting because India has, of course, had a very diverse culture, and there is an ongoing debate about what was the role of Buddhism and whether Buddhism at one time got into a very big conflict with Hinduism, and whether, just like sometimes some historians like to argue, that Shaivites and Vaishnavas also fought, and sometimes bloodily, over who would be predominant. Now, conflicts can happen, and religion can be used to justify conflicts between communities. But generally speaking, what you find about Indian history, as reflected in archaeology, actually in works of art, for example, is that there was a general sprinkling of Buddhism among most classes of society at one time, and even in royal families, you had some members of the family might be Jains or Buddhists, and others would practice their own so-called Hindu or Sanatan Dharma ritual. And they would often worship various gods and symbols. And you find that even in modern India, where a lot of Indians will have a statue of the Buddha in their homes, and they will offer flowers and diyas to Buddha, even though they are otherwise devout Hindus. Now, Sikhs, for example, had this tradition of symbiosis with Hinduism until some reformers of Sikhism decided not so long ago that if you were a proper Sikh, you should not go into Hindu temples and worship Hindu gods, which seems to have been a rather modern interpretation of Sikhism, because otherwise Guru Nanak worshipped Ram, and he always pointed to the one God which is there in the Vedas as well. So it's a modernization of the religious scene on the basis of the Western classification of religions. And supposedly, according to the Western, you might say, historical and scientific interpretation, a religion has to have a prophet or a few of them, a book, maybe a few of them, and it has to have a definite set of rituals and rules and a particular way of life. And that's what defines a religion. So Western anthropologists and sociologists have tried to see that sort of feature of religion wherever they have been. And of course, they have this tried to determine how a Hindu religious identity is defined, and how a Chinese Confucian identity is defined, and how a Japanese Shinto Buddhist identity is to be defined. But these are all very foreign concepts for the countries in which these classifications were made. So we should not rely on what is being prescribed by Western scholars, just as, for example, they will tell you that Buddha, was, the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, was actually an agnostic and a godless philosopher. And this is a completely westernized interpretation of the Buddha, because the Buddha worshipped Brahma and he worshipped a number of other devas. And he never said that, you should reject all the gods. He simply talked about the ability to achieve enlightenment without necessarily going through the Vedas. And he taught a particular vision of the self, of the human self, as being essentially inexistent. Although in the end he said, take the self as your only refuge. So we can see even in the Buddhist teaching there is some ambiguity there. But this being said, the mistake that has been made over the last few centuries is to try to fit the Western spiritual, the Western religious classifications or definitions into the Oriental matrix, or for example, the African matrix, or the pre-Columbian American matrix, or the Oceanic matrix, and say, okay, these people are like us, they just have a religion, but they haven't defined as well as we do, so we should help them to define it better. In other words, we should make them more like Christians, either by converting them or at least by making sure that their religions look like our religion in terms of status and statutes and system. So this is a mistake which is being exposed by better understanding of traditional religious, spiritual practices and texts. And as far as the again, secularism, it is based on an enlightenment vision, so-called enlightenment, which is essentially materialistic in the West. It emerged in the late 17th century, and it blossomed in the 18th and 19th century. And it's a vision of essentially which restricts everything to what you can physically experience. Anything which is not physically experienced and defined does not exist. Therefore, you can do away with most spiritual teaching, and you are left with, at best, a code of ethics. And that is essentially, they tell you that's the best. You don't need anything else. If you're a secular person, you don't need any religion or spiritual belief. You just have to have a moral code. You have to be an ethical person. And ethics should be universal. However, that is not so simple because people are naturally religious and they will find a religion one way or another, and that's why the so-called secular state is having problems because they can never meet citizens who are quite as secular as they should be, Either they are secular in the sense of being fanatically communistic, in which case they have their own religion, or they are secular by by saying, well, I do allow all religions, but I have mine. So they say, well, that's not quite the way it should be. You should be practically a purely utilitarian individual who should only be interested in achieving happiness and get maximizing his utilities, as Jeremy Bentham put it. So that sort of being does not exist. And it's interesting to note that the very concept of laicite or secularism in the atheistic sense was promoted by the Freemasonry. And Freemasonry is by no means a neutral system. Freemasonry has its own belief system, it has its own theology, it has its own cosmology, even though Freemasonries do not always agree with each other. So, in a way, Freemasonry was interested in perhaps substituting religion by its own brand of religious teaching.
No, you gave me a lot of things to ask, and I think we'll have to have two sessions on this discussion itself. Now, one of the things that comes to my mind naturally is, see, the religion which is in the Western concept, and you rightly said, they try to box Sanatan Dharma or Hinduism or Buddhism from a Western prism, which is absolutely right, and that's how they try to impose on the rest of the world that this is what we think is the thing. But you mentioned about Buddhism, and I have covered that in my two books, actually, Buddhism. And one of the reasons Buddha is one of the 24 incarnations of Vishnu, as mentioned in Bhagavad Puran. And that is the most authentic version of incarnation. If any incarnation has to come, if it is not in Bhagavad Puran, it is not considered incarnation. So one of the 24 incarnations mentions Buddha. So Buddha is a very recognized figure in Sanatana Dharma. The only reason why Hindus do not worship him, as even though they respect him, they offer flowers, they will offer everything to Buddha because he's Vishnu, is that he rejected Vedas so that the violence, the misuse of Vedas for killing animals should be stopped. That's why he rejected Vedas. That was the only reason why he rejected. And the Western identification of Gautam Siddhartha as Buddha is factually incorrect in many ways, because if you go by the timelines of the Vedas, then Buddha appeared around 1200 years after Krishna disappeared from the planet. So according to the Vedic timelines, Buddha is way earlier than what the Gautam Buddha they call it, which is a different, I say, because the concept is very simple. Vishnu doesn't need enlightenment. Vishnu, when he incarnates, he is enlightened himself because he is himself the god in a way. So that's why he was rejected by various Vedic saints, Ramanujacharya particularly, and also other Vaishnav saints as well as Shaivites. They both were united in that. The differences between Shaivism and Vaishnavism was only at the low level, like the people who are neophytes whose faith is new. But at the high level, Shaivites, because for all the Vaishnavites, Shiva is a perfect Vaishnava for Vaishnava. So they worship Shiva for gaining favor of Vishnu. So that's a basic religious fact. So now again coming back to this particular about the minority and the majority aspect. Now that aspect it was not there in the Indian culture from time immemorial because the citizens were not forced or in any way follow the king's faith or Raja's faith. Raja's faith was different because when you say Raj Dharma is pretty much that for the benefit of all the citizens or Janpad or the nation, all those things for the entire society. So that major difference in the political ruling was totally different, political administration. Now coming back to the history of the minority and majority and secularism. Now, if you look at the core definitions, then secularism particularly doesn't apply to a dharma society. Whether you're a Buddhist or a Vaishnav or a Shaivite or follower of Ganesh or Durga, any other divinity within the Vedic pantheon, within the Vedic culture, you do not have to be of the king's faith. So there is no majority minority because king has a different set of rules for ruling. So 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 this entire application of majority and minority to a Vedic society is impractical. Now coming back to separatism, you said, now Europe has been always divided in many ways for small kingdoms based on the same concept: Protestants versus Catholics versus Christians versus many other faiths. You have Gauls, and based on language or faith, either of the things. But India did not have those kind of division, despite Islam being a foreign identity or foreign mindset to India. But still Muslims were very much part of the culture until the separatism started. Separatism, you won't find, even though China, the Burma was divided, Sri Lanka was divided by the British on the political base, but not they did not seek separation from Sanatan Dharma. They were divided politically by the British. So the any of these faiths which are based on Dharma, separatism is very less. Do you agree, or what is your observation on that?
Well, you see, the concept of a nation state is a relatively modern Western invention. And if you look at India, it was always a common civilization, but there were many, if you like, if it was a Rashtra, but there were many kingdoms because the political entity is not necessarily coinciding with the geographical civilizational entity. So kingdoms come and go, depend upon the vagaries of history. And it used to be that in so-called Indo-Aryan or Indo-European societies, the king divided his kingdom into between his children, between his sons. So each son would get a smaller kingdom. This remained a tradition in India, but also in Germany and in many other parts of the Eurasian continent. Therefore, you had smaller and smaller kingdoms and different dynasties that emerged, and it didn't really impact the cultural, the civilizational unity. It could, of course, lead to wars, but wars were essentially matters of economics, politics, and also chivalrous cause that you had to prove your prowess by fighting your neighbors, and you had to carry these great expeditions, and you had to follow the white horse, the typical Vedic ritual, which the Persians also had, the ancient Persians. So essentially, war was like a tournament, and it doesn't make it very laudable, but that's the way it was. I mean, you basically had to keep fighting because you had to train yourself in order to be able to protect your kingdom, your family, your property. Therefore, war was like an exercise. So, in that context, you don't see the division of India into many kingdoms as a civilizational breaker. Nation states are different because nation states came only with the French Revolution, when it was admitted that a people had a right to its own land and had to rule itself. Before that, in Europe, the people were under the king, and the king ruled the state, but it was in essentially a family inheritance, and he could actually trade part of his kingdom with some other king. So people were passed from one king to another. It didn't change their cultural identity. It just made them be ruled by a different king. And this was possible because there was a generally common system of rules and a common system of faith. Therefore, people might be one day under the King of France, and 1 year later, they might be under the King of Spain. And this was regarded as quite normal. Now, of course, you consider every country as an indissoluble entity, and borders cannot be changed, and everything has to be kept frozen, as it were, which is again only going back to the late 1800s, and therefore, well, I mean the late 1700s to be more precise. So essentially, you see that our concepts have evolved so much that we cannot apply ancient realities to, or rather, we cannot apply modern concepts to ancient realities. And for that reason, I would say that in the case of Buddhism, to go back to Buddhism, we all know that Mahayana Buddhism recognizes a very long chain of Buddhas who came one after another and who were all incarnations of the same essential transcendent principle. So once you understand Buddhism in that light, you are quite at variance with the Western scientific or historical view of the Buddha as a man who came to fight the Brahmins and to fight Hinduism. It's not like that at all. And the fact that Buddhism migrated outside India and often carried with it the many devas of India, because the devas of India are worshipped in Thailand, in Laos, in Japan, in China. Why? Because Buddhism took the gods of India with the very message of the Buddha, which means that it was not a breakaway from Hinduism.
Right.
It was just, and of course, it was easier to accept. Even the Westerners say, we can understand Buddhism because there is one central figure. Whereas Hinduism is so confusing because there seems to be no central figure. There are so many divine and human personages that you are really left wondering, what exactly am I supposed to do to become a Hindu? It's a very, very fluid and very oceanic vision of spiritual culture.
So, given this discussion we are having on secularism, so with all this minority and majority concepts being very foreign to the Indian culture too much, separatism is something India has seen so many divisions. Like in 1919, they lost Afghanistan. 1947, they lost Pakistan. 1971, 1948, they lost Burma, and also 1948 they lost Sri Lanka, which was all part of the same culture, same society, everything. Now, and they due to the onslaught of Abrahamic culture, they completely lost them, division. So the country was divided based on the British viewpoint and the demand of the Muslim community. Now, with that being said, again the secularism is imposed where the majority feels threatened again by the same separatist mindset based on faith. Will the secularism can ever be work when one section of the community is always demanding more rights for themselves? In the case of India, and I'm sure it's going to come to USA in a big way in next 20 years. And I think
Yes,
balkanization of USA can be inevitable, and most of the Americans won't like it, but inevitable, because the same mindset is coming that we have a different culture and we have a different religion, so might as well divide the country into multiple portions.
well, Europe is in the throes of that. Most European countries are threatened by division. And that's where you see an interesting example of what happens with secularism pushed to its logical extreme. In the case of France, uh, because of the pressure particularly from the Muslim community, which is actually very uh, I would say, very problematic because they are not well integrated. Many of them do not probably want to integrate, and even if those who want find it very difficult. So as a result, there is that pushback in France, which is now harking back to the French Revolution and saying basically you should be a secular, everybody should be a secular French citizen, which means almost borderline atheist, and should not be allowed to show any kind of religious identity in public. So you are going back to this very revolutionary Napoleonic version of citizenship, that you are supposed to be only obeying the state and you are not to take any other authority. So that seems to be in itself a very, almost communistic vision, of the body politic, in which your only loyalty is to the party or the state, and there is nothing else than the French Republic, which is what they call in France the Republican values and the Republican spirit. But if you look at what's happening, of course, many people don't like it. They consider it sectarian. And in French society, I can see many manifestations of that mindset. For example, in France, as you probably know, there is very little tolerance of what they call sects. And sects in France have a very, let's say, negative connotation. For example, if you worship a guru, whether it's Ramana Maharshi or a living guru, you are already seen as somebody who is probably the victim of a guru. And a guru in French has become a dirty word. It's basically about somebody who puts people in his service, exploits them, claims to give them some hidden teaching, and basically takes their money and makes them completely dependent on him. And that's why whenever you hear the word guru in French public discourse, it is either ironical, or it is squarely condemnatory. So that shows you the very concept of a state which does not really accept any kind of separate spiritual religious identity, because that in itself makes you a dissident. You are supposed to be a good Republican French person, to like your wine and your cheese and whatever France praises and appreciates. But once you get into some sort of a sect, you are considered already a suspicious person or a victim. And that obviously has an impact on public policy as well. And it explains the difficulty that religious minorities have in France. I'm not saying that they are innocent. Some of them have also, a lot to essentially to blame themselves for. But the very perspective of the French secular laic state is by breeding some form of intolerance at the public level, which is very perceptible. And that is what, in my view, a country like India should always avoid, not fall into this kind of secularism, which becomes suspicious, narrow-minded, and in some cases, persecutory.
No, good points, and I think we have to continue the discussion much in the second part, because a lot of interesting things you said already. And one of the things which brings me to the point is that, especially if you look at from the Western perspective and American perspective, this secularism cannot last for a very long time, because all the new systems which are being run right now have to have one common viewpoint. Either we engage on one common minimum program, but the exploitation of the majority for the benefit of minority, it cannot work in any state. Cannot work. If some people claim that they have the right, and while others, some people say you have to earn the right. Now both are talking about the same thing, getting the rights. So one is through effort, another is by law. So then, when we talk about the rights by law, then if you claim your rights, then you're taking away somebody else's rights. It's a very logical thing. Rights are finite. So if somebody takes more rights for themselves, then somebody else loses the rights also. And so there has to be one common set of rights for everyone, which is uniform. We'll have a lot of discussion on this, Mr. Come Carpentier. I think you really enlightened us, and I think you gave us a great viewpoint how the Western society thinks. And we are living in I'm living in the Western society, but sometimes we have to get educated about the same society too. So thank you for joining today, and thank you all the viewers for watching it live. And if you want to see more, we'll have a second part of the same series as per availability of Mr. Carpentier, and then we'll set up the second session on the same series. Okay. Namaskar and thank you.
Thank you. Namaskar.